Throughout the unforgiving history of maritime life, some of the harshest punishments on captured female pirates were used to uphold discipline and control on ships. From marooning individuals on isolated islands to the terrifying ordeal of walking the plank, these brutal measures showcased the severity of seafaring justice. Such cruel practices were not only physically agonizing, but also served as effective deterrents, deeply influencing the lives of both sailors and pirates. But just how brutal were these punishments, and what made such extreme actions acceptable in such a perilous environment? No woman stood a chance in a naval courtroom built by men who saw piracy as an aberration, a crime against nature itself. The law had already condemned them before they spoke, their fates decided in candlelit chambers far from the trial stage. History does not whisper of mercy, it screams its absence. Captured female pirates faced judgment with no hope of reprieve. During the so-called Golden Age of piracy, British Admiralty courts showed no tolerance for the crime, but for women, punishment was doubled. They had broken imperial law, yes, but worse. They had violated the sacred order of gender. The men in powdered wigs viewed them with contempt, as creatures who had dared to wield weapons and command ships. Trials were performed like theatre, staged in makeshift naval tribunals across the colonies. Jamaica, New Providence. These places did not house justice, only sentencing. No jury listened to pleas, no careful weighing of evidence took place. The accused stood as ship captains and naval officers spat accusations, and terrified sailors were forced to testify, desperate to avoid association with the doomed. The legal process was swift, but thick with the grotesque. Anne Bonny and Mary Red, infamous for their defiance, faced such a court in Spanish Town in 1720. Bonny, doomed to the gallows, turned to her lover with bitter scorn. "If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." Their defence, the fragile shield of pregnancy. Pleading the belly, a rare protection afforded to women, bought them time, but only that. Luck had kissed them briefly. For most female pirates, no such mercy came. They stood silent as their verdict was declared, knowing they had been condemned long before their capture. The execution dock waited for them. The river was quiet, but its waters had swallowed the dead before and would do so again. The gallows rose above the murky tides. Pirates, men and women alike, were hauled through the streets toward their inevitable end, their wrists bound, their legs weighted with exhaustion. The British Empire made its warnings loud. Piracy was a capital crime, and the Piracy Act of 1698 ensured that no law would save them. At Wapping, the executioners did not offer mercy. The condemned were made to stand beneath the wooden beams, their necks wrapped in rope. They were not granted the swift relief of a long drop. Instead, they strangled. The short drop forced them into agony. Bodies convulsed, limbs jerked, faces twisted in desperate gasps as oxygen failed them. The Marshal's Dance, so named for its grotesque rhythm, turned dying pirates into writhing figures, flailing against their doom. Mary Critchett, an American pirate captured in 1729, suffered this fate without spectacle, without reprieve. No plea of pregnancy spared her. No delay granted her time to fight. The crowds jeered, the bodies twitched and stiffened, and then, when the law was satisfied, the corpses were left to rot. The worst offenders were gibbeted, strung up so that three tides could swallow them in death. The water dragged at their lifeless forms, lifting them slightly, pulling them downward again. The executioners had done their work, but the river was never finished. Before the rope came the whip. Flogging was a brutal art designed not only to punish but to degrade. Female pirates did not simply suffer, they were displayed. Their pain turned into warning. The executioner flexed the cat-o'-nine-tails in his hands, testing its weight. The whip was a monstrous thing, its knotted cords hungry for flesh. The first lash tore skin, the second carved deeper. By the fifth strike, flesh barely resembled flesh at all. Some received a dozen lashes, some received 100. The force curled around ribs, sliced open shoulders, split the skin of thighs and backs. The blood pooled on the docks, its scent thick in the air as townspeople watched. They were meant to watch. They were meant to learn. Anne Bonny and Mary Red, thrown into captivity in Jamaica, lived in filth before their trial. While records do not confirm whether they felt the whip, other female pirates, those who sailed the American coasts and the West Indies, were beaten bloody, their bodies used as tools of fear. The lash was meant to break more than skin. It was meant to break defiance itself. But some fates were quieter. Some women were not hanged, not whipped, but erased. Captured female pirates, particularly those seized in the Caribbean, West Africa and the Americas, were sometimes taken as spoils of war. They were not executed, but they were not freed. They were swallowed by a different kind of death, the slow suffocation of servitude. Sold in markets, branded and forgotten, dark-skinned women, regardless of their status aboard pirate ships, were often immediately assumed to be slaves. If they had once wielded weapons, once commanded men, once stared down the Navy's wrath with the fire of rebellion in their eyes, it did not matter. The market stripped them of legend. They vanished into plantations and merchant houses, their defiance crushed beneath the weight of forced labour, of silent suffering behind closed doors. No records tell their stories. No verdicts preserve their names. They were smothered by history itself. For others, death did not come with rope or blade. It came slowly, in the suffocating dark of prison ships. These hulks, abandoned warships stripped of sails, were never meant to hold men or women for long, but they became waiting grounds for suffering. Chained beneath deck, the prisoners breathed foul air thick with decay. Disease spread with merciless speed, typhus, dysentery, starvation. Food was scarce. Water was filth. The prison ships did not kill swiftly. They killed over weeks, over months, over years. Women on these ships suffered doubly. They were vulnerable in ways records refused to acknowledge. Guards watched them with cruel eyes. Sailors treated them as objects, not prisoners. But history does not preserve their agony. It does not document their pleas. It only records their silence. Piracy was punished with a brutality beyond justice. The Empire did not simply want to stop it, it wanted to extinguish it. Female pirates were hanged, flayed, enslaved, erased. Their punishments were not just sentences, they were lessons in terror. They were reminders that women who defied the natural order would be broken, would be buried, would be forgotten. The gallows, the whip, the prison ships, they were all instruments of control. And yet, the waters that once carried these women toward freedom still whisper their names. They are gone, but they are not silent. A fate worse than death. The horror that awaited female pirates. 3 tides to wash away the dead. Death was not always the end. For those the Empire deemed the worst of all offenders, execution alone was insufficient. The corpse had to suffer, had to remain in sight long enough to become a warning, a lesson carved into the collective fear of those who witnessed it. Their lifeless bodies, limbs stiffened in grotesque angles, mouths twisted into the last remnants of pain, were left swaying in the cold wind, dangling from the gallows, until 3 tides had rolled over them. The Thames rose, swallowed their feet, dragged at their bloated flesh, but did not release them. The sea had once been their domain, their escape. Now it came back, not to offer freedom, but to erode what little dignity they had left. The practice had a name, gibbeting, a punishment designed to extend the suffering beyond death, ensuring that the condemned did not just die. They were displayed, desecrated, and eventually devoured by time and tide. While male pirates met this gruesome fate more often, the mere threat of it was enough to send chills through every woman who dared command a ship. In the shadow of the gallows, female pirates were stripped of legend, reduced from symbols of defiance to cautionary tales, their bodies swinging over the water as warnings that piracy was never forgiven. Flogging, the art of prolonged agony. Before the rope, the whip tore them apart. Flogging was ancient and unrelenting, a punishment wielded by naval officers and colonial rulers with a precision that bordered on artistry. But for women, it was not just about pain, it was spectacle. Their suffering became theatre. Bound before a throng of gawking spectators, their backs were bared to the cold air, the skin unmarked, at first. The executioner flexed his hand, testing the weight of the cat-o'-nine tails, a monstrosity of knotted cords designed to not just cut, but rip. Then came the first strike. A crack split the silence. The flesh broke apart in jagged lines. Then another. By the 5th lash, the skin no longer looked human. By the 20th, the air was thick with the smell of blood. Punishment could range from a dozen lashes to over 100, depending on the cruelty of the court. No part of the body was spared. The force of the whip curled around ribs, flayed shoulders, carved into thighs. The victim was expected to endure without a sound, though silence rarely lasted. At docks, outside prison gates, even aboard ships, townspeople gathered to watch. Women were expected to scream, expected to bleed for their crimes in the full view of those who had never dared to defy the empire as they had. Anne Bonny and Mary Red, famed for their defiance, endured savage treatment even before their trials. Though there is no direct account of them being flogged, female pirates captured elsewhere, especially in the Americas and the West Indies, were routinely beaten, their agony wrung from them like entertainment. For naval officers, flogging was more than just punishment. It was control, it was degradation, it was the method by which women were reminded that their hands would never again hold a sword, never again take command of a ship. The blood soaking the cobblestones ensured the lesson was learned. Enslaved, a living death. Not all female pirates were killed. Some suffered a different kind of execution, one where death did not come swiftly but slowly, over years, over decades, over the span of a life stolen and reshaped into servitude. Captured women were sometimes spared the gallows, only to be forced into concubinage, into slavery, into the choking existence of coerced labour. Though historical records are sparse, historians acknowledge that women aboard pirate ships, particularly black and indigenous women, often face this cruel fate. In Spanish and Portuguese territories, where piracy blurred into privateering and smuggling, women found aboard captured ships were labelled spoils of war, taken to colonial markets, sold, branded and erased. Dark-skinned women, whether pirates or unfortunate captives, were often automatically assumed to be enslaved. They were absorbed into plantations, merchant houses, palaces, forced into concubinage, servitude, forced labour. And just like that, they disappeared from history. No verdicts recorded their fate. No execution logs listed their names. They vanished into households and ships' holds, erased without blood, without rope, but with the same finality as those sent to the gallows. A quiet death, marked not by the crack of the whip, but by the silence of records that never wrote them down at all. Prison ships, where death took its time. For some, the gallows never came. They were instead locked away on prison ships, left to rot, to starve, to die slowly, quietly, in disease-ridden floating tombs. The British Navy had long relied on decommissioned warships, stripped of sails, anchored in colonial ports, as makeshift prisons. For captured female pirates, these ships became the grave before the grave. The conditions were monstrous. Women were shackled beneath deck where air was thick with rot, where disease spread through the cramped bodies crammed together like refuse. Typhus, dysentery, smallpox, these became executioners far worse than any hangman. Food was scarce. Water was foul. Starvation claimed as many lives as the noose ever did. But starvation was not the worst of it. Many women suffered worse horrors: exploitation, mistreatment at the hands of guards, sailors, men who saw them as nothing more than collateral damage in a war they had dared fight. Yet these fates were never recorded. On these ships, history did not document executions, it documented absence, a silence that swallowed them whole. The maritime world's fear of defiant women. Their punishments were not just sentences, they were instruments of terror, of subjugation, of erasure. Female pirates were hanged, flogged, enslaved, forgotten. But more than anything, they were feared. Feared for their audacity, feared for their defiance, feared for the ways they shattered the expectations of women meant to be obedient, meant to be silent, meant to stay in their place. The gallows, the whip, the prison ships, none of it was just punishment. It was a warning, a lesson written in blood, in rope burns, in broken bodies swinging in the wind over the Thames. And yet, even now, their ghosts linger. Even now, their stories claw their way free from the silence that once tried to bury them.